Consciousness is not a mystery science is working to solve. It is a mystery science has quietly decided to stop asking about, not because the question is unanswerable, because the answer that keeps showing up is one that nobody in a tenured position wants to be the person to say first. You have been told your whole life that your brain produces your thoughts, that awareness, memory, emotion, the sense of being you, all of it is neurons firing, chemistry, electricity, nothing more. That explanation is what every textbook uses. It is what every hospital uses, every court, every philosophy department that wants to stay respectable. And according to the deepest, most honest corners of neuroscience and physics, it is not even close to a complete answer. So why has nobody told you? In 1994, a philosopher named David Chalmers stood up at a conference in Tucson, Arizona, and said something that made the room go quiet. He called it the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems of consciousness, he explained, are the ones science is actually good at. How the brain processes visual information, how it integrates signals from different senses, how it directs attention and stores memory. These problems are difficult in the technical sense, but they are solvable in principle by the same tools we already have. Study the mechanism, map the circuit, build the model. The hard problem is different. The hard problem is why any of that processing is accompanied by experience at all. Why does seeing red feel like something rather than nothing? Why does the sound of rain feel like something rather than nothing? Why, when a billion neurons fire in a precise pattern inside a 3-pound organ in your skull, is there a feeling of being someone watching all of this happen? That question has no answer in any textbook, written in any language, on any shelf, in any university on earth. Chalmers was not saying this to be provocative. He was saying it because it was true, and he was one of the first people in academic philosophy willing to say it clearly and publicly. The response from the neuroscience community was not enthusiasm, it was irritation. They had spent decades building a story in which consciousness was simply what complex computation felt like from the inside. Chalmers had just pointed out that this story explained nothing. Here is the version of this problem that keeps physicists uncomfortable at dinner. Every equation we have ever written to describe the physical world describes the third person. It describes what you can measure from the outside: mass, charge, spin, energy, position, momentum. Not one of those variables captures what it is like to be anything. Physics can describe every atom in your brain to arbitrary precision and still have said nothing about why there is an experience of reading these words happening right now. This is not a gap we expect to close with a better microscope. This is a structural gap in the language of science itself. The physicist Max Planck, who founded quantum theory, spent the last decades of his life saying things that his colleagues wished he would stop saying. He wrote that consciousness is fundamental, that matter is derived from it, not the other way around. He was not alone. Erwin Schrödinger, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, wrote an entire book called What is Life, in which he argued that the scientific worldview, taken seriously, points toward a single universal consciousness underlying all experience. John von Neumann, arguably the most technically precise physicist of the 20th century, concluded in his mathematical treatment of quantum mechanics that the wave function collapse requires a conscious observer, not a detector, not a camera, a mind. These are not fringe figures. These are the people who built the framework every physicist alive today works inside, and their private conclusions about consciousness are taught nowhere in the standard curriculum. That omission is not an accident. Francis Crick spent the first half of his career helping discover the structure of DNA. He won a Nobel Prize. He was as mainstream and credentialed as a scientist gets. In the 1990s, he shifted his attention to consciousness. He wrote a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis, in which he argued that all human experience is nothing more than the behavior of neurons. His argument was clean and confident. It was also, by his own admission near the end of his life, incomplete in a way that troubled him. Crick spent his final years working with a neuroscientist named Christoph Koch, trying to find what they called the neural correlates of consciousness, the specific brain patterns that corresponded to specific experiences. They found correlations. They did not find an explanation. A correlation tells you that when you see a red apple, a certain pattern of neurons fires. It does not tell you why that pattern is accompanied by the experience of redness rather than no experience at all. Koch, still working decades after Crick's death in 2004, has publicly moved toward a position called panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is not produced by brains, it is a fundamental feature of the universe. present to some degree in all matter. He did not arrive at this position because it was comfortable. He arrived at it because he spent 30 years looking for a mechanistic explanation, and it never appeared. In the 1980s, a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet ran a series of experiments that should have rewritten every textbook about human agency. They did not. Libet asked subjects to flex their wrists whenever they felt like it, and to note the position of a clock hand at the moment they felt the urge to move. He measured the brain activity accompanying each movement. What he found was something that researchers in the field have been arguing about ever since. The brain showed a measurable buildup of electrical activity, called the readiness potential. Approximately half a second before subjects reported feeling the conscious urge to move, the brain was preparing for the action before the conscious decision was reported, which raises the question that Libet himself spent years trying to answer carefully. If the conscious decision comes after the brain has already begun preparing, what is consciousness actually doing? Is it making the decision? Or is it watching a decision that has already been made by a process it has no access to? Libet himself never concluded that free will was an illusion. He suggested that consciousness might play a veto role, able to cancel actions it did not initiate. But the experiment opened a door that mainstream neuroscience has spent 40 years trying to partially close and partially ignore. The door says that the relationship between brain activity and conscious experience is not the simple one-way street the standard story requires. The brain does not simply produce consciousness the way a generator produces electricity. Something stranger is happening, and the honest answer to what that something is remains unknown. Here is the version of this story that gets told in introductory neuroscience courses. Consciousness is what the brain does. The mind is what the brain produces. When the brain stops, the mind stops. Question closed. That story is not wrong exactly. It is incomplete in a way that functions like dishonesty. It is incomplete because it skips the hard problem entirely. It treats the most important question as already answered when it has not been touched. It is the equivalent of someone asking how a refrigerator works and being told it makes things cold. Technically accurate, informationally useless. The reason the cover story persists is not that it is supported by evidence. It is supported by convenience. A world in which consciousness is just neurons firing is a world where medicine, law, and ethics can operate without facing the most destabilizing question in human history. If consciousness is fundamental, if it is not produced by the brain but is something the brain participates in, then the implications for every institution built on the materialist assumption are enormous. What happens to the definition of death? What happens to the treatment of patients in minimally conscious states? What happens to the question of animal rights? What happens to every courtroom argument built on the idea that a person is simply a biological mechanism? These are not abstract questions. They are practical, legal, and political, and the answers change dramatically depending on which picture of consciousness turns out to be true. Institutions have enormous incentive to avoid that disruption, so the cover story holds, and the hard problem stays in the philosophy department where it cannot do any damage. There is a pattern that repeats across the history of consciousness research. Scientists spend their careers defending the conventional view. Then, in their final years, they say something different. Crick was troubled by what was missing. Koch moved to panpsychism. Carl Sagan, the most famous science communicator of the 20th century, wrote in his final book that he believed there were phenomena science had not yet found tools to describe. He did not say what he meant specifically. He was careful, but the gesture was clear. William James, the founding father of American psychology, spent his entire career arguing against the reduction of consciousness to brain activity. He believed consciousness was more like a receiver than a generator, that the brain tuned into awareness rather than producing it. His view was mainstream for a period and then displaced, not because it was refuted, because a generation of researchers decided the opposite assumption was more productive for building a science. Productivity and truth are not the same thing. That distinction is the one that gets quietly buried in every department that has decided what it believes before looking at the evidence. If consciousness is fundamental and not produced by the brain, then your awareness did not begin when your neurons organized into a pattern complex enough to sustain it, and it does not end when those neurons stop. That sentence has implications that most people need to sit with before they can process them. It does not mean anything simple or comforting necessarily. The details would require an entirely different video, but it means the picture you were given, awareness as a byproduct of chemistry, is a working assumption that the people who understand the evidence most deeply have been quietly stepping away from for decades. Not publicly, not in press releases, in papers, in letters, in books written late in long careers. The same way Einstein wrote his real views about time to a grieving family rather than in a journal. The same way the founders of quantum mechanics wrote their real views about mind in books their colleagues politely ignored. The conspiracy is not dramatic. It is 100 years of smart people finding a result they do not know what to do with and choosing to table it rather than say it out loud in a room where the wrong person might hear. You are not a machine that learned to think. You are whatever it is that is reading these words right now and wondering what it is. That question has been open for the entire history of science. It is still open, and the people most qualified to answer it are the ones most carefully saying nothing. The next time someone tells you science has basically figured out consciousness, ask them to explain the hard problem. Watch what happens to their answer. Ask them why the founders of quantum mechanics, the people who built the tools every physicist alive today relies on, believed consciousness was fundamental. Ask them why the leading researchers in the field are moving toward panpsychism after 30 years of looking for a mechanistic explanation and not finding one. That pause, that search for words, that is the sound of a field that knows more than it is saying. You are not your brain. Or if you are, we have no idea what that means. And the honest version of science admits that. The uncomfortable version of science, the version that shows up in the actual equations, and the actual data, and the deathbed letters of the people who spent their lives on this question, keeps pointing somewhere that nobody has the courage to name clearly yet. Whatever you are, you were never just chemistry. And somewhere in a quiet corner of the literature, the people who know the most about this have already written that down. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.